Chapter 1. Before the school bell, long before the sun touched the tiled roofs of Roman houses, before the streets filled with footsteps and merchants' voices, the world of a Roman child was already beginning to stir. There were no school bells. There were no clocks, but there was rhythm and there was expectation. In ancient Rome, childhood did not follow a universal pattern. It unfolded differently depending on birth, class, and luck. For the sons of senators and wealthy merchants, childhood might include a quiet room, a wax tablet, and a slave to carry books. For others, especially those born into poorer families or into slavery, childhood meant labor, early responsibility, and very little time for letters or numbers. Yet across much of Roman society, there was a growing idea that children should be taught. Not all children, not equally, but taught nonetheless. Education in Rome was not a public system. There were no state schools, no universal right to learn. Instead, teaching was a private matter, arranged by parents and paid for out of pocket. Those who could afford it sent their sons to a hired teacher or brought tutors into the home. Those who could not made do with what they had. Stories, imitation, work. Girls, even in wealthy households, were often taught at home. They might learn to read, to write, to sing, and to manage a household. But few ever entered a formal classroom. For boys, however, the classroom could be the first step towards something larger, a place in public life. Before school began, a Roman child's education started in the family. Parents, especially mothers, played a key role in the earliest lessons. They taught children how to speak properly, how to greet others, how to behave during meals, and how to show respect to the household gods. These lessons were not written down, but they shaped a child's world more than a scroll. The father's role, especially in elite families, was to model Roman values. He was expected to teach his sons discipline, self-control, courage, and a sense of duty. Sometimes he did this through stories of famous ancestors, sometimes through silence, and sometimes by arranging a formal education outside the home. At around age 7, many boys began attending school, often accompanied by a slave called a pedagogus, who guided them, protected them, and kept them in line. This was not a grand schoolhouse, but rather a small group of boys gathered under the eye of a literator, the most basic kind of teacher. There were no desks, no blackboards, and often no roof. The lessons took place in a corner of the forum, a rented room, or even outdoors, where shadows of pillars might offer some relief from the sun. Learning began slowly with the alphabet, repeated over and over again. Boys scratched letters into wax tablets using a stylus, then smoothed the wax to begin again. Reading came next, then writing whole words and sentences. Arithmetic was taught with pebbles or counting boards, long before paper or books were common. It was not a gentle process. Teaching relied on repetition, memorization, and strict discipline. A boy who made mistakes could expect harsh correction, sometimes in the form of the teacher's rod. Yet parents expected this. A certain amount of fear was thought to sharpen the mind. Still, for all its severity, education was seen as a privilege. In a world where many never learned to read, to sit with a tablet and recite lines from an old poem meant you were being prepared for something greater. Not only for knowledge, but for a place in the life of the city, or even the empire. Those early days of learning were slow and quiet, full of murmured letters and scraped wax. There were few rewards and little praise. Yet for the boys who stayed with it, the schoolroom was the doorway to a wider world of law, language, history, and power. As the first sunbeams slipped through the alleyways of Rome, school began not with bells, but with footsteps and shadows. A boy walking beside his slave, tablet under arm, toward another long day of repetition and silence. There was no noise of running feet, no laughter in hallways, no clock to signal the hour, just the soft rhythm of stylus on wax and the long patience of learning by memory. Chapter 2. The first day of school. The Roman child's first day of school was not marked by bright banners or cheerful greetings. There were no school bags, no chalkboards, and no scent of paper and glue. Instead, it began quietly. A small boy, perhaps just 7 years old, was led through narrow streets by an older companion, clutching a wax tablet under one arm and a slender stylus in his hand. His guide was not a parent, not a friend, but a household slave known as a pedagogus. This figure was often stern and silent, tasked with escorting the child safely, keeping him disciplined, and watching his behavior during the day. The pedagogus did not teach, but he watched everything, always nearby, always present. There were no formal school buildings in ancient Rome. School was a loose arrangement, often held in whatever space a teacher could afford or claim. Some hired rooms near the forum. Others gathered students under the shade of a portico or simply in a quiet corner of the street. School could be anywhere, and it often was. Dust, wind, and noise were part of the background. The teacher who greeted new pupils was the literator. He was not a philosopher or public speaker, but a basic instructor, responsible for teaching the alphabet, reading, writing, and simple arithmetic. His methods were shaped by repetition, habit, and strictness. There were no games, no colorful charts, no rewards for effort, just voice, memory, and a stick to maintain order. On the first day, the boy learned to listen. The literator would speak the letters of the Latin alphabet aloud, slowly and clearly. The students were expected to repeat them in chorus, over and over. A, B, C, D, then again. Then backwards, then in pairs. The sounds of the alphabet filled the space like a chant. Not meant to entertain, but to embed. Writing was introduced with a wax tablet. These small wooden boards held a smooth layer of dark wax. The stylus, pointed at one end and flat at the other, was used to scratch letters into the wax and then erase them again. Each letter took shape with careful effort. Curved lines were the hardest. Mistakes were common. The wax was forgiving, but the teacher less so. Arithmetic began with pebbles or a counting board. Addition and subtraction were taught through objects, not abstract numbers. Multiplication came much later, and division was rare. The goal was not to understand deeply, but to remember quickly. Facts were valued more than insight. There were few comforts in the Roman classroom. Children sat on stools or on the ground. There were no desks, no cushions, and no warmth in winter. In summer, the heat pressed down like a weight. In winter, fingers stiffened around the stylus. Still, the lessons continued. Attendance was not optional. Absence meant punishment, not sympathy. Discipline was part of the daily rhythm. The literator held a rod, and it was not for show. A missed answer, a slow reply, or wandering attention could bring a sharp reminder. Fear was considered useful. A child who was afraid was thought to be focused. Praise was rare. Progress was expected. The day was long. There were no exact hours, but lessons often began shortly after dawn and continued until midday. Breaks were few and short. The children recited, copied, erased, and started again. There was no end-of-day bell, just the quiet signal to gather their things and return home. For many, the first day of school was the beginning of years of repetition, pressure, and tired hands. Yet it was also the opening of a door. To read and write in ancient Rome was to have a chance at a different future. One not guaranteed, but possible. As the boy walked home, the wax tablet tucked under his arm once more. He carried no prize, no drawings, no homework, only the sound of letters still echoing in his ears. A, B, C, D again and again. The start of something slow, difficult, and deeply Roman. Chapter 3. Learning with wax and stylusin. The Roman classroom. Learning was a physical act. There were no printed books, no soft pencils, no paper to crumple and throw away. Instead, a Roman student met the world of words and numbers through tools that were simple, sturdy, and surprisingly silent. Chief among them were the wax tablet and the stylus. The wax tablet, or tabula, was a flat, rectangular frame made of wood, filled with a dark layer of wax. It was not meant to last. In fact, its greatest quality was that it could be used again and again. Students carried them daily, often tied together in pairs or even groups of 3, like the pages of a foldable book. The wax bore scratches, dents, and the faint echo of yesterday's efforts. The stylus was a slender instrument, pointed at one end for writing, and flat at the other for erasing. Its body could be made of wood, metal, or bone. It did not glide over the wax but pressed into it with deliberate pressure. Each letter took shape as a small carved path, and a mistake could be smoothed away with a stroke of the flat end. There was no ink to spill, no lead to snap, no eraser dust. Learning with wax and stylus required patience. The surface was small, the lines crude, and the pressure of the hand constant. There was no way to write quickly without sacrificing clarity. Letters were formed slowly, one by one. The alphabet, once memorized aloud, was now drawn over and over into the soft wax. There were no illustrations, no diagrams, no colored ink to guide the eye. Everything was taught by repetition. A teacher would recite a phrase and the students would copy it onto their tablets, then erase, then repeat. Reading and writing were not separate tasks. They developed side by side with the same limited set of materials. Wax tablets were not only for letters. They were also used to practice numbers. Arithmetic exercises were scratched into the surface and calculated by counting stones, called calculi, or with a simple counting board. Roman numerals, with their long strokes and lack of place value, made certain calculations more difficult. Yet students were expected to memorize facts, not understand theory. Reciting multiplication tables, even without a deep grasp of what they meant, was part of daily work. Copying was a central method. The teacher would dictate, or a model text might be scratched into a master tablet for students to copy underneath. Over time, the text became more complex. Short moral sayings, proverbs, and eventually lines from Roman poets or playwrights. These phrases were chosen not only for their structure, but for their values. A student did not just learn Latin grammar. He absorbed Roman order. Mistakes were not hidden. In wax, errors were obvious. Crooked letters, misspelled words, uneven spacing. The correction was immediate. Smooth the wax, and begin again. There was no pile of discarded pages to track progress, only the same few boards rewritten day after day, slowly becoming more legible, more correct, more Roman. In the background, the classroom was never entirely quiet. The sounds of styluses scraping, of boys muttering syllables, of teachers reciting and correcting filled the air. A visiting parent or passerby would not hear a lecture. They would hear a rhythm, soft, persistent, like waves against stone. Over time, students learned to write without wax. Parchment and papyrus were used for more formal writing, though they were expensive and handled with care. Ink was made from soot and resin, sometimes thick and sticky, sometimes watery and faint. Quills or reed pens replaced the stylus. But wax remained the foundation, the tool for mistakes, for early practice, for repetition. It was not a glamorous process. There was no ceremony in forming a crooked C or in memorizing the parts of speech, but it was the quiet foundation of Roman education. A discipline built not on creativity but on structure, not on invention but on memory. As the wax softened in the afternoon heat and the stylus slipped more easily across the surface, learning continued. Not loud, not fast, but steady. The tools were simple, the lessons hard. The results slow to come. Yet for those who endured it, the wax tablet was the first doorway. Through its surface passed letters, numbers, phrases, and eventually ideas. Scratched, erased, and scratched again, until one day, the marks became meaning. Chapter 4, Teachers, Spaces, and Discipline at the Roman School, was not a building. It had no fixed walls, no entrance gate, no playground. In many ways, it was as temporary and improvised as the lives of those who taught in it. A classroom could be a rented room, the shaded edge of a colonnade, or a quiet corner of a city square. The learning that took place there was shaped not by architecture, but by the voice of a teacher, the silence of students, and the ever-present possibility of correction. Roman teachers were not members of a formal profession. They did not receive licenses or training from the state. Instead, they were private individuals who offered their services for pay. Some were highly respected. Others struggled to gather even a small group of pupils. Many were former slaves or freedmen who had received an education in the household of a former master. A few were philosophers or rhetoricians. Most were simply literate men who made a living by teaching what they had once learned. There were different levels of teachers. The literator, sometimes called the magister ludi, taught the basics: letters, reading, writing, and simple arithmetic. The grammaticus took over once students could read, offering instruction in grammar, poetry, and literature. The reader trained older boys in the art of speaking, argument, and persuasion. Each level represented not just a step in knowledge, but a shift in social expectation. But it was the literator who saw the most students, and who faced the greatest challenges. His classroom was rarely ideal. If indoors, it might be cramped, dark, and filled with echoes. If outdoors, it was exposed to noise, weather, and distraction. The furniture was minimal. A few stools, perhaps a bench. Most students sat on the ground, tablets on their knees. The teacher had a stool or a chair, and sometimes a rod beside it. The rod, or ferula, was not symbolic. Discipline was central to Roman education. A student who misbehaved, who spoke out of turn, or who failed to memorize a passage might be punished swiftly. Corporal punishment was accepted, expected, and rarely questioned. The teacher's authority rested not on inspiration, but on control. There was little space for play in the Roman school. The day began early, often shortly after sunrise, and continued until midday. There were few breaks. Students recited aloud, copied phrases, and waited their turn to be corrected. The teacher moved from boy to boy, glancing over tablets, pointing out mistakes, giving orders. It was a system built on repetition and fear. Yet some students thrived in this environment. The ones who could memorize quickly, who sat still, who copied cleanly. These were praised, sometimes publicly. But praise was measured. Teachers avoided creating envy among pupils. Order was more important than enthusiasm. Some classrooms had assistants, older students who helped manage the younger ones, or scribes who read aloud while others wrote. But most were simple affairs. One man, 10 to 20 boys, a few tablets, and the long hours of a Roman morning. The teacher's status in society was mixed. Some parents admired him. Others saw him as a servant, easily replaced. His income depended entirely on how many students he could gather and how long their families continued to pay. There were no guarantees. A teacher who lost favor could lose his livelihood overnight. Despite this, many teachers took pride in their work. They saw themselves as part of a long tradition, stretching back to Greece and forward to Rome's future. They shaped the next generation of speakers, lawyers, poets, and officials. Though their tools were simple and their rooms unimpressive, their role was central to Roman life. In this world, learning was not gentle. It was not creative, but it was structured. It had a rhythm of wax and stylus, of voice and correction, of order and silence. The Roman classroom was a place of form, of memory, of discipline. The teacher sat in the center, holding together a fragile space in which the next citizens of Rome were slowly, carefully formed. Chapter 5. Learning by repetition in the Roman classroom. Repetition was everything. There were no printed textbooks, no colorful charts, no workbooks to fill with answers. There was only the human voice, the wax tablet, and the unending cycle of hearing, writing, erasing, and beginning again. Roman education was not built on understanding in the modern sense. It was built on memory. A student was expected to absorb and repeat, not to question or explore. This approach was not considered dull or limiting. On the contrary, it was seen as the foundation of all learning. A sharp memory was a powerful tool, and it was sharpened by constant use. The day in school began with recitation. Students, seated on stools or the floor, listened to the teacher speak aloud a passage, perhaps a list of syllables, a proverb, or a line from a well-known text. Then they repeated it, in unison or one by one. There was a rhythm to the room. The teacher's voice, followed by the chorus of young voices. Then silence. Then the voice again. Then the reply. This repetition extended to writing. The same letters, the same words, the same phrases were scratched into wax tablets over and over. Erased, rewritten, compared, corrected. A single proverb might be copied 20 times before the student was allowed to move on. Neatness mattered. So did spacing. So did form. Not because of aesthetics, but because form was tied to discipline, and discipline was tied to virtue. The texts used for memorization were not random. They were carefully chosen to reflect Roman values. Short sayings about duty, loyalty, hard work, and obedience were common. So were examples from history and mythology, stories of bravery, sacrifice, and cleverness. A student did not simply learn language. He learned how to think like a Roman. Mistakes were part of the process. A poorly formed letter, a misquoted line, a forgotten ending. Each brought correction, often sharp. The teacher might point out the error and demand it be written again. Or he might raise his rod as a warning. In some classrooms, older students corrected younger ones. In others, the teacher kept full control. There was little reward beyond progress itself. No stars, no praise, no display of work on the wall. Advancement came in the form of new material, a more complex passage, a more difficult list of words, a first taste of poetry. The student who memorized quickly moved forward. The one who lagged behind stayed where he was, copying the same sentence while others advanced. Reading aloud was another essential part of learning. Even older students were expected to recite, to pronounce clearly, to speak in rhythm. Reading silently was rare. The voice carried the words. The act of speaking was considered a form of learning. Pronunciation mattered. Tone mattered. A well-spoken line was not only correct, it was Roman. Some teachers encouraged the use of hand gestures during recitation, especially as students advanced. This prepared them for the rhetorical training to come. Even at an early stage, education aimed toward public life. A student who could speak with clarity and presence had a future. One who could not might remain unseen. The tools of repetition were simple: the voice, the stylus, the wax. But they created something powerful. They shaped not just knowledge, but habits. The habit of attention, the habit of effort, the habit of silence when others spoke. In time, the memorized phrases became part of the student's thinking. The proverbs were recalled in conversation. The lines of poetry reappeared in letters and arguments. The discipline of repetition left deep traces. Even those who left school early carried its echo with them. This system did not encourage curiosity. It did not reward imagination, but it produced something Rome valued even more: control, fluency, and the ability to recall the right words at the right time. As the morning wore on and the sun passed overhead, students recited one final time. The same line, again, then again, then again, then one more. The teacher nodded. The tablet was smoothed. The stylus sat down. Another day, carved into wax, now erased, but not forgotten. Chapter 6. Fear and Obedience. The Roman classroom was not a place of comfort. There were no soft voices, no playful encouragements, no colorful posters with smiling faces. Instead, there was order. There was expectation. And there was fear. Fear was not considered a flaw of the educational system. It was part of the system. Roman adults believed that discipline began with obedience, and obedience was often shaped by punishment. The teacher held not only knowledge but authority, and in many cases, a rod. This rod, called a ferula, was made of wood or bundled reeds. It was not hidden in a drawer or hung on the wall. It rested near the teacher's seat, always within reach. Sometimes it was used sparingly, sometimes not. A child who spoke without permission, who failed to memorize a line, who slouched or whispered or showed signs of boredom, might feel its sting. Corporal punishment was accepted across Roman society, in the home, in the fields, in the army, and in the classroom. It was not seen as cruelty, but as a necessary correction. The teacher, like a father, was responsible for shaping the child's character, and pain, they believed, taught quickly. Obedience in the classroom was more than silence. It was posture, attention, speed of response. The student was expected to sit upright, listen carefully, and repeat words exactly as heard. A pause, a stammer, a missing syllable. Any of these might be interpreted as laziness or defiance. The presence of the pedagogus, The household slave assigned to accompany the child reinforced this discipline. He watched not only on the journey to school, but during lessons. If the student misbehaved, the pedagogos might report it at home or correct it on the spot. In some cases, he carried his own rod. Even among students, discipline was enforced. Older boys might be given minor authority over younger ones, acting as monitors or assistants. Peer pressure added another layer of control. A classroom with 20 boys and one teacher could not function without a shared sense of rules and consequences. Rewards were minimal. A nod from the teacher, a small word of approval, perhaps the chance to recite first the next day. But pride was found less in praise and more in avoidance. Avoidance of correction, of public error, of the teacher's rod. Despite this harshness, Roman parents valued education deeply. They believed that self-control, endurance, and respect for authority were the foundations of adulthood. School was not only a place to learn Latin, it was a place to learn how to be Roman. And being Roman meant accepting structure, hierarchy, and consequences. There were, of course, differences between teachers. Some were patient, some were harsh, some ruled by fear, others by habit, but few questioned the role of discipline in learning. Without order, there could be no knowledge. Not all students responded the same way. Some withdrew, some rebelled, some thrived. The quiet boy who memorized perfectly, who spoke only when called upon, who never dropped his tablet or smudged his letters. He was the ideal. He needed no correction, or only a little. He passed through school like a shadow, always there, never noticed. The Roman system did not ask whether a student enjoyed learning. It asked whether he submitted to it. And through that submission, it believed he would emerge stronger. In time, some students began to internalize the rules. They corrected themselves before the teacher could. They recited with care. They checked their wax tablets twice before presenting them. They became models of Roman obedience, shaped not only by instruction, but by the ever-present memory of correction. As the day ended and the boys rose from their places, the room emptied quietly. There was no bell, no clapping, no shout of joy, just the sound of sandals against stone and the rustling of tablets tied together for the journey home. In the fading light, the rod remained on the teacher's bench. Unused perhaps, but never far away. Chapter 7. Grammar and Grape Poets 4. Those Roman boys who advanced beyond the early years of reading and writing, a new stage of education awaited. One that brought them into contact not only with more complex language, but with the very heart of a Roman cultural identity. This stage was guided by the grammaticus, the teacher of grammar, literature, and memory. The grammaticus was not a teacher of simple letters. His students were older, usually around the age of 12, and had already mastered the basics of Latin reading and writing. Now they entered a world of interpretation, of poetic form, of sentence construction and subtle meaning. It was a world shaped by the works of great writers, and it was a place where memory and language became one. The curriculum of the Grammaticus centered around a small number of revered texts. Chief among them were the works of Roman poets such as Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. Sometimes the class would also study older Greek authors, like Homer and Euripides, in translation, or for those who could, in the original Greek. These texts were not read for entertainment. They were dissected, line by line, word by word. Each day began with the teacher reading a selected passage aloud. The students listened, styluses ready. The passage would then be copied carefully onto wax tablets. Once it had been written, the teacher would begin his explanation. Grammar first, then meaning, then style. Every word was analyzed. What was the verb form? What case was used? Why was that adjective placed before the noun and not after? The students followed with attention. They copied notes. They committed rules to memory, but they also learned to observe. The placement of words, the rhythm of a line, the choice of metaphor, all of it mattered. The Grammaticus did not merely teach correct Latin. He taught beautiful Latin, persuasive Latin, the kind that could stir hearts and shape opinion. Memorization remained central. Students were expected to know long passages by heart. They would be called on to recite, not only with accuracy, but with grace. Their voices had to match the tone of the text. A tragic line was spoken slowly with weight. A clever line required sharpness. Performance mattered even now. The wax tablets gave way more often to ink and parchment. Mistakes were harder to correct. Precision became more important. Spelling, once secondary, was now observed carefully. Word endings, punctuation, the careful separation of thoughts, all these were signs of refinement. The student was no longer learning to speak. He was learning to speak well. Alongside poetry, students studied prose authors. Speeches by Cicero were especially important. These provided not only examples of complex Latin, but also introduced rhetorical devices, sentence patterns, and persuasive structure. The student learned how to argue, how to arrange points, how to conclude with impact. Even if he would never become a lawyer or senator, these skills were part of what made a Roman citizen whole. The classroom of the grammaticus was quieter than that of the literator. There were fewer students, and they were more focused. The punishments were fewer, the lessons longer. It was a place of thought more than correction, of language more than fear. Still, the teacher held authority. The rod was not absent, but it was used less often. Here, the student was expected to govern himself. Progress was measured not in tests, but in speech. Could the student read with clarity? Could he explain a metaphor? Could he compare two lines and say which was stronger, and why? The answers did not lie in books, but in the student's voice. And yet the school of the Grammaticus was not a place of debate. It was not yet time for original thought. Students were to admire, to copy, to remember. They were not encouraged to challenge the texts. These poets were considered perfect. Their words were models, not mysteries. Through this training, the Roman boy absorbed more than grammar. He absorbed an identity, the stories of Aeneas, of Ulysses, of brave warriors, and clever women became part of his internal world. These figures stood beside the gods, the ancestors, the values of the city. To know them was to belong. As the afternoon sun slanted across the floor and the copies of Virgil's lines faded under tired eyes, learning continued. Not loud, not fast, just steady, persistent, shaped by memory and tradition. The voice of the Grammaticus, explaining once more a turn of phrase, while the students nodded and took up their pens. The words of the poets were old, but in the wax and ink of the Roman classroom, they lived again. Chapter 8. The Art of Speaking in the Roman World. The ability to speak well was more than a skill. It was a sign of status, a pathway to power, and a deeply admired art. The final stage of formal education for a Roman boy was not focused on numbers or memorization, but on words spoken aloud, arranged with care, and delivered with purpose. This was the domain of the rhetor, the teacher of rhetoric. Only a few students reached this stage. Those who did were usually from wealthy or ambitious families, destined for public life. The classroom of the rhetor was not crowded. It was quieter, more focused, and far more demanding. Here, students did not copy sentences or memorize lines. They crafted arguments. They learned how to think, to persuade, and to perform. Rhetoric in Rome was not empty speech. It had structure, rules, and centuries of tradition behind it. Students learned how to build a case, to introduce a topic, to lay out facts, to respond to objections, and to conclude with force. Each part had a name, a purpose, a method. The speeches of Cicero were the standard. His words were studied, imitated, and sometimes repeated word for word. The teacher would assign themes for practice. One day, a student might argue whether a man who saved the city deserved a crown. Another day, he might defend a son who disobeyed his father. These were fictional cases, but they followed real legal and moral questions. The point was not to win, but to convince. Students were expected to write their own speeches, then stand and deliver them. The voice had to be strong and clear. The gestures had to be measured. The gaze had to be steady. Even the way a student walked to the front of the room mattered. Rhetoric was performance, and performance was judged. There were no modern tools, no microphones, no slides, no written notes in the hand. Everything came from memory. A strong speech was learned by heart, then spoken as if it had just been thought of. That was the goal, to seem natural while hiding the work behind it. Critique was part of the lesson. After a speech, the teacher would respond. He might praise a clever turn of phrase or correct a weak argument. Sometimes the student would be asked to deliver the speech again, but with a different tone or from the opposite side. The point was not just to speak, but to adapt. Beyond speeches, students also learned the art of letter writing. Formal letters were an important part of Roman life. In politics and law, in family affairs. A well-written letter could open doors, settle disputes, or leave a lasting impression. Like speeches, letters had a form. They began with a greeting, followed a logical flow, and ended with a respectful close. The training in rhetoric was not just preparation for courtrooms. It was preparation for life as a Roman citizen. In the Senate, in assemblies, in legal disputes, and family councils, the ability to speak clearly and persuasively shaped outcomes. It was said that in Rome, a man with words could achieve more than a man with wealth. Even those who did not pursue public careers carried this training with them. They used it in business, in negotiation, in commanding others. Rhetoric taught control, not only of language, but of self. The student learned to pause, to breathe, to respond. He learned when to speak and when to remain silent. The teacher of rhetoric was often a respected figure. Some had themselves been lawyers or speakers. Others had studied in Greece or Alexandria. They carried a quiet authority, less stern than the literator, more refined than the grammaticus. Their lessons were as much about posture and presence as about grammar or logic. As students reached the end of their schooling, their education shifted from repetition to refinement. The wax tablets gave way to parchment. The rod disappeared. The voice became the central tool. A student who once mumbled letters now stood tall and spoke in measured tones. In these final years of study, the Roman boy became something more. Not only a student, but a speaker. Not just someone who knew words, but someone who could use them to argue, to lead, to shape others. And as the shadows lengthened in the classroom of the rhetor, the teacher called one more student forward. Another speech, another case, another chance to turn words into something greater. No audience but his classmates, no reward but a quiet nod. Yet this too was Rome. Chapter 9: Girls and Education in the Roman World. Education was not given equally. Boys and girls were born into the same city, under the same laws, into the same families. But the paths they walked were different. Nowhere was this more visible than in how and whether they were taught. Roman girls did not attend the same schools as boys. There were no shared classrooms, no coeducational learning, and no formal expectation that a girl would study beyond the household. Yet this does not mean Roman girls learned nothing. They did learn, but they learned in ways shaped by their role in the family, their status in society, and the quiet boundaries of domestic life. In wealthier households, girls were often taught to read and write. This instruction happened at home, usually from a parent, a private tutor, or a trusted slave. There was no classroom, no bench, no rod. The lessons were gentler, though not necessarily easier. A girl learned how to keep accounts, manage correspondence, read letters, and understand the religious and legal traditions of the household. These skills were practical, not philosophical. Some girls learned poetry. Some were taught music. A few learned Greek. These were signs of refinement, not preparation for public life. A girl's education was meant to prepare her for marriage, motherhood, and the management of a Roman household, not for courtrooms, councils, or the Senate floor. In lower-class families, the picture was simpler. Girls often worked from a young age. If they learned letters, it was because someone at home knew how to teach them. If they learned to calculate, it was to help in the shop or at the market. Education here was lived, not formal. Recipes, prices, prayers, and family stories were passed down in speech, not writing. There were exceptions. A few women, often from elite or intellectual families, received full educations. They read widely, wrote poetry, and engaged in philosophical debate. Some became teachers. Others were respected for their letters or learning. But these were rare, and even they were expected to remain within the sphere of the home. Society did not see this as unfair. It was seen as natural. Roman values placed men in the public eye, and women in the private space. Boys were raised to speak aloud. Girls were raised to listen, to manage, to support. Although the city belonged to the male voice, the home belonged to the female presence. Still, Roman women were not silent. They wrote letters, managed estates, and ran businesses. They prayed, made contracts, and raised children. Many of them passed on values and knowledge more lasting than what could be found in schoolrooms. A mother's guidance, a grandmother's instruction. These too were forms of education. Girls also learned by watching. They watched the rituals of the home. They observed the management of servants and meals. They listened to stories told by elders, remembered birthdays and traditions, and helped care for younger siblings. Over time, these experiences formed habits, and those habits became wisdom. In some homes, girls were taught side by side with their brothers in early years, before the boys left for school. They shared tablets, copied letters, and listened to readings. But by the time the boy entered the world of the literator, the girl remained behind. Their paths divided quietly, without ceremony, without question. It was rare, though not unheard of, for a woman to become known for her learning. Poets mentioned educated women with admiration. Inscriptions honor wives who were called docta or learned. A handful of names survive in history, but most girls who learned to read and write left no record. Their knowledge lived within the family, passed quietly from one generation to the next. In the evenings, while the city settled into silence and oil lamps flickered in the courtyards, a mother might sit with her daughter and trace letters in the dust, or read aloud from a scroll, or tell a story from the past. There were no grades, no tests, no applause. Just learning, slow, gentle, private. The Roman schoolroom was a world of order, fear, and memory. But beyond its walls, in the shaded spaces of the home, another kind of education continued. One shaped not by rods and repetition, but by rhythm and routine, by conversation and care. And so the Roman girl learned, not in public, but in presence. Not for power, but for life. Chapter 10. Education and Social Power in Rome. Education was never just about knowledge. It was about belonging. It was about order. And it was always about power. From the first whispered recitation of the alphabet to the careful delivery of a speech before classmates, the Roman educational journey shaped more than the mind. It shaped a place in the world. Who received education, how it was given, and what was taught. All of it reflected the deeper structure of Roman society. The system was not designed to uplift everyone. It was designed to sort, to separate, and to prepare the few for roles of influence. Most Roman children never entered a classroom. Many never learned to read. For those who did, education became both a tool and a signal. A tool for action, and a signal of status. To read and write in Latin was to step into a language of power. It was the language of law, administration, property, and politics. Those who mastered it could take part in legal contracts, official correspondence, public debate. Those who did not were excluded from those spaces, even within their own city. The wax tablet and the stylus may have looked simple, but they were the first tools of a public voice. They taught not just letters, but discipline. Not just grammar, but hierarchy. The classroom mirrored the society beyond its walls. Teacher above student, older boys above younger ones, correction from above, silence from below. Advancing through the levels of education, from literator to grammaticus to rhetor, was more than academic progress. It was social mobility, carefully controlled. The further a boy went, the more likely he was to enter professions of influence. Law, governance, religion, military leadership. Each level opened a new gate. But those gates were guarded by cost. Schooling required time and money. A family needed wealth to pay the teacher, a slave to escort the child, parchment and ink for advanced study. For the poor, even if a child was bright, education remained out of reach. There were no scholarships. There were no free schools. Talent without resources went unnoticed. The content of education also reinforced the social order. The stories chosen for memorization were stories of loyalty, courage, sacrifice, but also of obedience, duty, and tradition. The great heroes of Roman myth were those who served the state, respected the gods, honored their fathers, and accepted fate. These lessons were more than literary. They taught how to behave in a society where citizenship, class, and lineage shaped every opportunity. A boy who could quote Virgil or structure a legal argument marked himself as part of the elite. One who could not, did not. For girls, the effect was more subtle. Their education was quieter, more domestic. But even here, social class mattered. A wealthy girl might learn to write refined letters and manage a household. A poorer girl learned through labor without the luxury of parchment or quiet afternoons. In both cases, education confirmed roles more than it changed them. There were rare stories of mobility. A freed slave who became a teacher, a merchant's son who studied rhetoric and entered politics, a girl remembered for her learning. But these were exceptions, noted precisely because they were uncommon. Education also played a role in Roman identity beyond the city itself. In the provinces of the empire, to speak Latin and adopt Roman schooling was to signal belonging. A boy in Gaul, Syria, or North Africa who learned to write like a Roman was more than a student. He was becoming Roman. Education became a form of cultural expansion, subtle and lasting. At its core, Roman education was less about opening minds than shaping citizens. It offered structure, trained memory, demanded order. It did not ask questions. It gave answers. It did not promote invention. It preserved tradition. And through this, it served the Roman state. As the wax hardened in the cold and the ink dried slowly on the scroll, the work of shaping minds continued. In every classroom, the quiet repetition of rules and rhythm, of poetry and law, created not only students, but servants of a larger order. To be educated in Rome was to carry that order forward, one carefully memorized line at a time. Chapter 11. The role of the pedagoguson. The daily rhythm of Roman schooling. One figure walked beside the student from the very beginning, quietly shaping the path, enforcing the rules, and remaining always nearby. He did not teach. He did not speak much. Yet without him, the Roman classroom could not function. His name was the pedagogos. The pedagogos was a slave or freedman, often Greek, assigned to accompany a child, usually a boy, to and from school. But his role went far beyond escort. He was part guardian, part disciplinarian, part moral guide. In many homes, especially among the elite, the pedagogos spent more time with the child than either parent. He walked beside the boy each morning, holding his writing tablets, carrying spare styluses, sometimes even bringing a stool. He ensured the student arrived on time. He observed his behavior during lessons. He corrected mistakes not of grammar, but of posture, tone, and manners. He was the silent shadow of education. The name pedagogos comes from the Greek for child leader, not in the sense of authority, but in the sense of physical guidance. He led the child through the streets, through the curriculum, and through the expectations of Roman society. He taught not with words, but with presence. The pedagogos was often literate, though not always. In wealthy homes, he might have once been a scholar himself, captured or sold into slavery after war or debt. In others, he was chosen for his patience, reliability, or quiet firmness. He held no power of his own, but he was entrusted with one of the family's most valuable assets, its future. Inside the school, the pedagogos sat nearby. He did not interfere with lessons, but he watched. A glance, a cleared throat, a quiet word could remind the boy to sit straight, to focus, to show respect. If the teacher punished, the pedagogos reinforced. If the teacher praised, the pedagogos observed with silent approval. Outside the classroom, his role continued. At home, he ensured the child practiced, reviewed assignments, or simply behaved with dignity. He reminded the boy to greet his elders, to speak with care, to listen more than he spoke. He was not a family member. He was not a friend, but he was constant. In literature and satire, the pedagogos is sometimes mocked, portrayed as overly strict, humorless, a barrier between child and freedom. But in many households, he was respected. Some were remembered in family inscriptions. A few were even granted freedom or mentioned in wills. Quiet loyalty was often rewarded in time. For the child, the pedagogos represented stability. Teachers might change. Lessons might grow harder, but the same figure appeared each morning to tie the sandals, carry the wax tablet, and walk the familiar path. He was not a parent, but he belonged to the boy's world in a way few others did. There was no graduation for the pedagogus, no clear moment when his duties ended. Sometimes he served until the boy reached manhood. Other times he was reassigned or returned to other work. But while his role lasted, it was central. A quiet, firm presence at the edge of every Roman lesson. As the boy whispered lines of poetry or scratched numbers into wax, the pedagogus waited nearby. He did not speak unless needed. He did not smile unless allowed. But he was there, a figure of discipline, memory, and daily repetition. And when the lesson ended and the students rose, the pedagogus gathered the boy's belongings, nodded to the teacher, and led him back through the streets of Rome. The school day was over. But the education continued, one quiet step at a time. Chapter 12. Education. In the Roman provinces, the city of Rome was not the only place where learning shaped lives. As the empire expanded across continents, Roman education moved with it, from the hills of Hispania to the coasts of Asia Minor, from North Africa to the frontiers of Britannia. Classrooms appeared in cities that had once known nothing of Latin, of styluses, or of the measured voice of a grammaticus. In these provinces, Roman education took many forms. Some towns had established schools, supported by local elites who admired Roman ways. Others relied on private tutors, hired by families who wanted their children to rise in Roman administration. In some places, instruction was offered in both Latin and Greek, reflecting the cultural layers of the empire. The content of provincial education closely mirrored what was taught in Rome. Boys learned the alphabet, practiced on wax tablets, and memorized poems. The same values, obedience, discipline, respect for tradition, were instilled, but the setting was different. The sounds of other languages surrounded the classroom. Local customs shaped daily life. And sometimes even the teachers were native to the province, trained by someone who had once studied in Rome. Learning Latin was a gateway. It opened access to Roman law, Roman trade, Roman power. A boy who could read a decree or write a formal letter had a tool that others did not. In many provincial cities, literacy in Latin became a sign of prestige, even if only a small fraction of the population achieved it. But the provinces also brought something to Roman education. They brought resilience, adaptation, and cultural blend. A student in Gaul might speak Celtic at home, then recite Virgil in class. A teacher in Syria might quote Homer in Greek before returning to Latin grammar. The Roman system absorbed, rather than replaced, these layers. Not all provinces had equal access. In remote areas, schools were few, and students scarcer. Some communities resisted Roman influence. Others embraced it. Over time, schools tended to cluster in cities, especially those with Roman colonies or military settlements. There, education supported administration, law, and communication with the capital. In North Africa, cities like Carthage became centers of learning. In the East, Alexandria remained a beacon of philosophy and science. These places blended Roman forms with older intellectual traditions. Students learned Latin, but also Greek. They read Roman poets, but also Egyptian, Punic, or Greek texts, depending on the region. Girls in the provinces faced the same limitations as in Rome. Their education, if it occurred, was usually domestic and informal. But in some communities, especially those influenced by Hellenistic traditions, educated women were more visible. Inscriptions tell of learned daughters, women who composed verses or studied with private tutors. For provincial elites, education was a way to climb the Roman ladder. A family might send a son to Rome to study, hoping he would return with skills and connections. Others hoped their children could enter local administration, become scribes, or advise governors. School was not simply a place of learning. It was a bridge into Roman identity. Yet despite these goals, the daily life of a provincial student was not so different from his counterpart in Rome. He sat on a stool or the floor. He copied lines into wax. He recited aloud. The tools were the same. The discipline was the same. The dream of advancement, quietly shaped by memory and repetition, remained. In the distant corners of the empire, far from the Senate and the marble temples, a child learned his letters. The accent might be different. The teacher might be local, but the pattern of education, slow and quiet, continued, carried by stylus and tablet, across borders and generations. And so the Roman classroom, though born in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, found its way to distant cities and quiet courtyards. The wax may have been made from local bees, the scrolls copied on foreign parchment, but the words and the form endured. Education became one of Rome's most lasting gifts, or one of its most subtle tools. Chapter 13. The voices of the poor in the grand cities of the Roman Empire, where senators walked beneath marble arches and merchants shouted prices in crowded forums. Another life unfolded. Quieter, harder, and far more common. It was the life of the poor. And for most of them, education was not a daily concern. It was a distant idea, as unreachable as the golden statues on temple roofs. The Roman poor, whether in cities or countryside, had little time or money for schooling. Children were needed at home or at work. They fetched water, helped in shops, followed herds, or watched younger siblings. They rose early and slept tired. For them, education came in other forms. Through labor, conversation, observation. Yet this does not mean they were ignorant. Knowledge took different paths. A child might learn the value of weights and measures by helping at a market stall. He might learn to count by sorting grain or to recognize letters by watching scribes or reading signs painted on city walls. Much of this was unspoken learning, shaped by need, not curriculum. In the crowded neighborhoods of Rome's poor, walls often served as pages. Political slogans, poetry, prayers, insults, and names, scratched into plaster or painted in bold red letters, filled the city with informal texts. A boy who could not afford a teacher might still learn to read by tracing the graffiti, sounding out the names of gladiators or local tradesmen. For some poor children, a small measure of formal education was possible. A charitable relative, a local patron, or even a neighbor might pay a teacher's fee for a few weeks. In some neighborhoods, informal teachers offered cheap instruction, not in Virgil or Cicero, but in reading contracts, writing names, adding sums. This was education stripped to its essentials, just enough to survive, to trade, to write a simple letter home. Slaves, too, were part of this world. Many were uneducated, taught only to obey. But in households that valued skill, some slaves were trained to read and write for practical reasons, to manage records, to copy texts, to serve as clerks or messengers. These skills could increase their value, and in rare cases they became a step toward manumission. Even among the poor, there were stories of learning. A stonecutter's son who became a scribe, a former slave who opened a small school in a back alley, a girl who learned letters while helping her father at a shop. These stories were not common, but they existed, like thin lines of ink on rough papyrus, fragile but clear. The difference in educational opportunity was not only about money. It was also about time. The Roman elite had leisure. Their children could spend hours copying poetry. The poor had no such luxury. Time was food, was rent, was warmth in winter. Time could not be spared for memorized proverbs or carefully scratched declensions. Still, the poor observed the same world. They heard the speeches in the forum. They saw the magistrates in their togas. They watched scribes at work, children reciting lines, and teachers correcting with a glance. They knew what education meant, even if they could not touch it. There was no resentment in every case. Some accepted their place. Others dreamed of more, but the structure of Roman society made such dreams heavy. The path from poverty to learning was steep and rarely climbed. In the stories told later, in the histories and memoirs, the poor rarely appear. Their voices are faint. Their words are not written down. But in the daily life of Rome, their presence was constant, and their ways of knowing, though different, were real. A boy who never learned to write might still learn the price of wheat across seasons. A girl who never read a scroll might still know which herbs eased pain. These, too, were forms of learning, not celebrated, not preserved in marble, but passed quietly from hand to hand, from mother to child, from work to understanding. And so, while the wax tablets of the wealthy recorded lines of poetry, the poor carried knowledge in calloused fingers and careful memory. Their classrooms were markets, kitchens, workshops, and streets. Their teachers were life, necessity, and the rhythm of survival. Not every Roman child learned to read, but every Roman child learned something. Chapter 14. Writing Beyond School. Letters, lists, and ledgers. The Roman classroom taught the child how to shape letters, how to recite poems, how to memorize the language of poets and orators. But beyond those school walls, writing took on new forms. In markets, on tablets, in ledgers and letters, the written word became a quiet companion of daily life. It was no longer a tool of schooling, it became a tool of the world. In Roman society, writing was both ordinary and powerful. It was present in contracts, prayers, price lists, and tombstones. It appeared on shop signs and public decrees, carved into stone or painted on plaster. In its everyday use, writing was practical, brief, and deeply woven into the rhythms of labor and law. One of the most common uses of writing was the letter. Romans wrote letters to friends, clients, business partners, and family members. These letters carried news, gave instructions, made requests, and offered comfort. Some were formal, others informal. Some were dictated to scribes, others were scratched in careful lines by the writer himself. They were folded, sealed with wax, and handed to messengers who carried them across cities or provinces. Letter writing was taught in the higher stages of education, but even those who never studied rhetoric often learned how to write a simple message, a greeting, a question, a line of thanks. For merchants, officials, and travelers, the ability to write a letter was not luxury. It was necessity. Another quiet form of writing was the list. In shops, sellers kept accounts. Goods received, goods sold, debts owed, farmers made records of harvests. Bakers tracked deliveries of flour. These lists were often written on wooden tablets or cheap scraps of parchment. Some were brief, others detailed. Most were not preserved, but some have survived, offering glimpses into daily Roman transactions. Ledgers used by estate managers and city officials followed more complex forms. They recorded payments to workers, rents collected, grain distributed, or taxes owed. These were structured texts with columns and totals. Reading them required skill. Writing them required even more. Scribes played a key role in this world. In cities, professional scribes offered their services to those who could not write. They sat in public places with their tools ready, ink, stylus, and board. A client would speak, and the scribe would write. These written messages might be letters, legal complaints, contracts, or records. Some scribes specialized in copying texts, others in recording proceedings, others in managing private correspondence. In homes, writing served domestic needs, inventories of household goods, instructions to servants, notes left between family members. These were not grand works of literature. They were brief, functional, and usually anonymous, but they remind us that literacy, even when partial, touched many layers of Roman life. Even prayers were written. Small tablets with inscriptions were left at temples, asking for healing or protection. Some were formulaic, others deeply personal. These defixionanes, curse tablets, were written by those who sought justice or revenge, folded and nailed, and buried near graves or shrines. The writing was not for human eyes, but for the gods or spirits who read without light. Chapter 15. Private tutors and home education. Not every Roman child sat in a public classroom or listened to lessons in a shared space. For some, learning took place in the quiet rooms of the family home, where the teacher came to them, not the other way around. This was the world of private tutors. A quieter form of education, more personal, more flexible, and more tightly bound to the rhythms of elite domestic life. In wealthier Roman households, especially among the senatorial and equestrian classes, hiring a private tutor was a mark of status. These tutors could be slaves, freedmen, or hired professionals. Their qualifications varied. Some had studied in Alexandria or Athens. Others had once served as scribes or clerks. A few were native speakers of Greek, brought to Rome to teach children the language of Homer and Plato alongside Latin. The tutor, often living in the household, was responsible not only for instruction, but also for supervision. In some homes, he began his day with the child and stayed until night. He helped with reading, writing, recitation, and review. He corrected errors, assigned passages, and sometimes guided the child through the early stages of philosophy or rhetoric. Lessons took place in the atrium, the peristyle garden, or a quiet room near the family library. There was no fixed schedule, though mornings were preferred. The day's learning unfolded between meals, visits from clients, and religious observances. The setting was informal, but the expectations remained high. The advantage of home education was individual attention. The tutor could adjust the pace, return to difficult topics, or skip what the student already knew. There were no distractions from other pupils, no need for public correction. The learning could be shaped to the child's personality, strengths, and future role in the family. Parents played a quiet but powerful role. Fathers especially oversaw the child's progress. They expected discipline, fluency, and steady improvement. Some sat in on lessons. Others reviewed the student's work at the end of the day. In some cases, they directed the curriculum themselves, selecting texts, arranging exams, or even quizzing the child during meals. Home education was not always gentle. The rod, the raised voice, the sharp correction, these could appear even in private rooms. A tutor who failed to maintain order risked being replaced. A child who resisted instruction might face consequences from both tutor and parent. Yet many households valued stability. A tutor who was firm but patient, knowledgeable but modest, could remain for years. Some families had multiple tutors, one for Latin, one for Greek, one for arithmetic, one for music. In the grandest homes, a young boy might grow up surrounded by a quiet circle of scholars, each shaping a part of his mind. This was not typical, but it was admired. To be educated by private instruction was seen not only as effective, but noble. Home education extended to girls more often than classroom schooling. While they were usually excluded from formal schools, daughters of the elite might receive instruction at home alongside brothers, especially in early years. They learned to read and write, to sing, to manage household accounts, and to compose short letters. Some studied poetry. A few, especially in cultured families, read Greek or learned geometry. The relationship between tutor and student varied. In some cases, it was distant, structured by hierarchy and control. In others, it became affectionate. A well-liked tutor might be remembered for life, even mentioned in the student's epitaph. A few became family advisors, or even friends. When guests visited, the child's learning might be displayed. A boy asked to recite a poem. A girl praised for reading aloud. These performances were not only moments of pride, but proof that the family had invested well in tutors, in values, in the shaping of character. Private education also allowed for early specialization. A boy destined for law might study legal texts before his peers. A future poet might begin composing verses under the guidance of a literary tutor. Home instruction could open paths that public schooling would delay or ignore. Yet for all its advantages, private education also carried risks. It could isolate. It could shield the child from challenge or competition. A tutor who taught poorly or favored flattery over rigor might leave the student confident but unprepared. Still, for many Roman families, home education offered a balance between tradition and control. It allowed learning to grow within the walls of the household, shaped not only by books but by daily life, family values, and personal rhythm. And so, in quiet rooms far from the noise of the forum, a boy recited his lines to a patient tutor, while his wax tablet rested on his knees and the household busts watched from the corners. No classmates, no classroom, just the old words, the waiting stylus, and the slow turning of memory into voice. In the army, writing was used for orders, reports, and daily records. Soldiers were expected to recognize commands. Officers needed to compose brief, clear documents. Some military camps had small libraries. Some had classrooms for training. The written word marched with the legions, not in scrolls of philosophy, but in sharp commands and tallies of supplies. Education gave access to this world. A boy who learned to write in school could one day keep accounts, record votes, or write a message that would travel farther than his feet ever could. Even those who learned only the basics found use for their skill. A short line of text could open a door, and for some, writing became art. Poets composed verses not for recitation alone, but for the page. Philosophers wrote letters meant to be read by many. Historians recorded wars and laws. These were not written in wax, but on scrolls of parchment and papyrus, carefully stored, sometimes copied, sometimes forgotten. Still, most Roman writing was not preserved. It faded, was washed away, or burned. What survives are fragments of letters, lists, ledgers, and lines of hope. Each one a quiet echo of someone who once took up a stylus and made a mark. And so, beyond the classroom, writing lived. Not in loud recitations, but in the daily motion of hand and ink, of numbers and names, of quiet decisions made permanent in lines drawn across the surface of the world. Chapter 16. Education and Religion in Ancient Rome. Education and religion were never far apart. Though formal schooling focused on language, literature, and logic, the sacred world of gods, rituals, and beliefs quietly shaped the learning of every Roman child. From the first letters scratched into wax to the final recitation of a poem, the divine was always nearby, not always spoken of, but always present. Religion in Rome was not confined to temples. It lived in homes, in streets, in laws, and in calendars. It marked the rhythm of the year with festivals, sacrifices, and public holidays. It guided decisions, inspired fears, and explained fortune and misfortune alike. In this atmosphere, even a lesson in grammar took place beneath the gaze of the gods. The Roman household had its own sacred space, the lararium, a small shrine to the household gods. Children learned early to greet these deities, to stand with stillness during prayers, to offer small gestures of respect before meals or after returning home. These acts were not taught in school. They were taught by watching, repeating, and remembering. Still, religion occasionally entered the classroom. Students copied proverbs that praised the gods. They recited passages from poetry that told stories of Jupiter, Juno, and Mars. They read myths as literature, but also as moral instruction. A tale of punishment became a warning. A story of sacrifice became a lesson in duty. Festivals provided breaks from school, days when lessons paused and the city turned to celebration or solemn observance. The Saturnalia, for instance, disrupted daily order with games, gift-giving, and a reversal of roles. Even the teacher might smile. Other festivals, like those honoring Vesta or Minerva, reminded children that certain gods watched over learning, writing, and speech. Minerva in particular was the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and craft. She was often associated with education, and some classrooms kept a small image of her nearby. Students were encouraged to honor her, not with grand rituals, but with silent respect, perhaps a whispered hope for a steady hand or a clear mind before a difficult recitation. Priests and priestesses were not usually teachers, but some religious institutions maintained libraries, trained scribes, or preserved texts. Sacred colleges oversaw the interpretation of omens, the maintenance of rituals, and the preservation of tradition. Literacy was essential to their work. A boy trained in letters might one day serve as a scribe in a temple, recording prayers, offerings, or celestial signs. Religion also shaped the moral content of education. Roman virtues, pietas, gravitas, fides, were grounded in religious thought. Respect for elders, loyalty to the gods, discipline in life. These were not merely civic values. They were sacred duties. A student who learned to recite a proverb about honoring one's father was also learning how to honor the divine order. In some cases, children entered religious roles while still young. A girl chosen as a Vestal Virgin would be removed from her family, trained in ritual purity and serviced to the goddess Vesta. Her education was narrow but intense, focused on rites, silence, and sacred fire. Boys chosen for certain priestly colleges underwent instruction in chants, sacrifices, and laws of ritual purity. Education also prepared future magistrates who had to oversee public religious events. A well-educated Roman needed to understand the correct form of prayer, the structure of omens, the meaning of portents. Mistakes in ritual could anger the gods. Precision mattered. In the provinces, religion blended with local traditions. Students might learn Roman myths alongside native ones. Local deities, might be honored alongside Jupiter and Mars. The classroom became a place where belief systems overlapped, merged, or quietly coexisted. A student in Gaul or Syria might invoke a god unfamiliar to his teacher, and still receive a nod of approval. Education did not ask for belief, it asked for knowledge. A student was not tested on faith but on accuracy. Could he name the gods of the Capitoline Triad? Could he explain the story of Romulus and Remus? Could he recite the lines from Virgil that invoked divine fate? These were the markers of literacy, not piety, but the boundary was thin. As the boy grew older, he learned to navigate this world with care, to speak of the gods with reverence, to perform the proper gestures, to recognize that learning was not only about letters, but about the invisible rhythms that shaped life and death. And so, even as he sat with his tablet and stylus, copying a line from Horace or rehearsing a legal formula, the Roman student did so in a world watched by the divine. Not loudly, not always visibly, but steadily. The gods were present not as teachers, but as witnesses. Chapter 17. When school ends. Youth and the path to adulthood for the Roman child. The school years passed slowly. Days of repetition, long hours with stylus and wax tablet, and the quiet pressure of correction defined early life. But eventually the lessons came to an end. And when they did, the student was no longer simply a child. He was on the threshold of something new. A Roman youth, stepping toward the structure and responsibility of adulthood. There was no single moment when school ended. For some, it came early. A boy from a modest family might leave formal education after mastering basic reading and writing. He would then take up work, assist in a family business, or begin an apprenticeship. For others, especially sons of the elite, education continued through adolescence, and sometimes beyond, through grammar, rhetoric, and even philosophy. But whenever it ended, the transition was marked not by a graduation ceremony, but by a shift in role. The boy who once followed a pedagogist to school now walked alone. He exchanged wax tablets for scrolls, rough linen for the toga of manhood. The Roman toga virilis, the toga of the grown man, was the clearest outward symbol of this change. Worn for the first time during a coming-of-age ritual, usually around the age of 14 to 16, it marked the boy's entry into public life. He was no longer under the legal authority of a tutor or guardian. He became a citizen in full, with new rights and new expectations. The ceremony was simple but full of meaning. Surrounded by family, the youth dedicated his childhood bulla, a protective amulet, to the household gods. He removed his childhood clothing and was dressed in the plain white toga, unlike the purple-edged version worn by younger boys. Then, often accompanied by his father or male relatives, he was introduced to the forum, the heart of Roman public life. For those who had studied rhetoric, this was not just a symbolic gesture. It was the first step toward a career in law, politics, or public service. The skills learned in school were now tools to be tested. A young man might begin by observing court cases, attending Senate sessions, or making short public speeches under the guidance of a mentor. Others entered the military. For many Roman boys, particularly those from equestrian or senatorial families, a period of military service was expected. They began as junior officers, learning command, discipline, and the realities of Roman expansion. Education had prepared them not for battle itself, but for the responsibilities that came with leadership. Still others turned to administration. Literacy opened doors in the imperial bureaucracy, in municipal government, or in temple service. The ability to read and write clearly was essential in a world run by decrees, ledgers, and correspondence. A well-educated young man might become a clerk, a notary, or a legal assistant, roles that required quiet precision more than oratory. For some, school ended in uncertainty. A family that could no longer afford a tutor might send a son to work. A youth who had struggled with lessons might turn to farming, labor, or trade. Education had not failed him, but it had not offered a path forward. Still, the memory of letters remained, and even basic literacy gave him a silent advantage in a society of signs, lists, and ledgers. The friendships formed in school often faded. A child's classmates were drawn from his neighborhood, his family's circle, or his teacher's other students. As they entered adult life, Their paths diverged, one to the military, one to a shop, one to the Senate, but for a time they had sat together, repeating the same lines, writing the same letters, enduring the same corrections. That memory lingered. For girls, the transition from learning to adult life came even earlier. A girl might be married before the age of 14. Her education, if she had received one, faded into the background of domestic life, used in managing a household, in reading family correspondence, in teaching her own children. Education in Rome did not promise a future. It prepared for one. The tools of school were put aside, but the habits remained: discipline, attention, memory. These were not discarded with the wax tablet. They were carried forward quietly into the years ahead. And so the Roman student, now grown, stepped into the world, not with celebration, but with purpose. The voice once trained to recite lines now spoke for contracts or commands. The hand that copied verses now wrote orders or names. The lessons were over, but the learning had only changed form. Chapter 18. What remained? The long shadow of Roman learning long after the voices of Roman schoolboys had faded, after the tablets had been smoothed for the last time and the teachers had fallen silent. The patterns of Roman education continued to echo. They echoed through centuries of history, through languages and laws, through classrooms built in different lands, under different skies. Though the Roman Empire itself would eventually collapse, its way of learning did not vanish. It left a long, quiet shadow. Roman education was never designed for everyone. It was limited, unequal, narrow in its subjects, and strict in its methods. But it was also systematic. It valued memory, form, order. These values survived in medieval monasteries, in Renaissance courts, in the lecture halls of Europe's first universities. The Roman model reappeared, reshaped, but familiar. The texts remained: the poems of Virgil, the speeches of Cicero, the short moral sayings once copied by students, lived on in manuscripts, copied and recopied by monks and scholars. They were studied not just for language, but for rhythm, logic, and clarity. They became standards once more. The methods remained too: the chant of the teacher, the recitation by the student, the slow work of copying and correcting. All of it passed into new generations of education. Even the fear, the discipline, the sharp correction echoed through time. The rod may have changed shape, the wax may have hardened, but the posture of the student remained. In the early Christian world, Roman education was adopted and adapted. Church fathers had studied under grammarians and rhetoricians. Their sermons and letters bore the traces of rhetorical training. In Christian schools, Latin became the language of learning. Scriptural interpretation was shaped by habits of grammar and logic formed long before Christianity spread. Later, during the Renaissance, Roman ideals returned with new energy. Humanists rediscovered old texts. They admired Roman prose, Roman poetry, Roman order. Educated men once again learned to speak with balance and care, to write in Latin, to argue and persuade. The pedagogus had vanished, but the idea of education as formation, of mind, body, and voice, returned. Even today, traces remain. The alphabet, still taught in classrooms around the world, follows the path laid down in Roman schools. The idea of learning to read before learning to write, of reciting aloud, of studying grammar before composition. These practices carry the faint imprint of Rome, but more than tools or texts, what remained was the belief that education could shape identity, that a student, through repetition and attention, could become something more, that the act of learning was not only for work, but for becoming Roman, or later, Christian or European or modern. Roman education did not encourage creativity. It rarely rewarded questioning. It demanded silence, structure, and obedience. And yet, it gave generations the ability to read, to write, to remember. It gave them a shared language of poems, of virtues, of laws. That language crossed borders. Roman students became lawyers, priests, soldiers, clerks, emperors. Their training followed them, not just in words, but in habits, in the way they stood, the way they spoke, the way they listened. And so the Roman school did not end when the last wax tablet crumbled, or when the teachers grew quiet. It continued, reshaped, reframed, but always recognizable. In every classroom where a student sits upright, listens closely, repeats what is heard, and slowly learns how to speak clearly, something of Rome remains. The stylus is gone. The rod is gone. The toga and the pedagogus are gone. But the long shadow of Roman learning still stretches quietly across time, soft and steady, like the morning light across the floor of a forgotten classroom.